In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where alien civilizations measure strength by the size of their fleets and the ferocity of their warriors, humanity was considered nothing more than a curiosity, a small fragile species that had somehow stumbled into the cosmic arena. And among humans, she was dismissed as the weakest of all, just a girl with gentle eyes and a quiet voice. But sometimes, the universe's greatest underestimations become its most dangerous oversights. Sometimes a simple medal hanging around someone's neck carries the weight of legends that could shatter empires. And sometimes those who appear most harmless are the ones who have already faced monsters that would make gods tremble. The Galactic Council was about to learn why humans had a saying, "Still waters run deep." They were about to discover that behind her shy smile lay a story that would redefine their understanding of courage, sacrifice, and what it truly means to be human in a universe that had forgotten the power of the seemingly powerless. The grand halls of the Galactic Council stretched endlessly upward, their crystalline walls catching and refracting the light of 1,000 distant suns. Representatives from across the galaxy filled the massive amphitheater, their forms as varied as the worlds they hailed from. The Krillian delegation towered 12 feet tall, their chitinous exoskeletons gleaming like polished obsidian. The ethereal Vorthak floated in translucent bubbles filled with their native methane, their tentacles writhing in complex patterns that served as their language. The reptilian Zephyrans sat in perfect formation, their golden scales catching the light as they observed everything with predatory precision. And then there were the humans. 3 representatives sat in a section that seemed almost comically small compared to the massive spaces allocated to other species. The human delegation looked pathetically insignificant among the giants and energy beings that dominated the council chambers. But it was the 3rd human, a young woman who appeared to be barely out of adolescence, that drew the most dismissive glances and barely concealed snickers from the assembled beings. Sarah Chen sat quietly between Ambassador Harrison and General Morrison, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. At 24, she looked even younger, her delicate features and slight build making her appear almost childlike among the imposing figures that surrounded them. She wore a simple dark suit that seemed to dwarf her petite frame, and around her neck hung a small, unremarkable medal that caught none of the light that illuminated the grander decorations worn by other delegates. The session had been called to discuss humanity's recent application for advanced membership in the Galactic Council, a status that would grant them access to higher-level technology exchanges, protected trade routes, and, most importantly, a voice in galactic defense strategies. For 3 hours, the various species had taken turns explaining why humanity was entirely unsuited for such an elevated position. Supreme Chancellor Vexthar of the Krillian Imperium rose from his massive seat, his voice resonating through the chamber's translation systems like grinding stone. The human species has proven time and again that they lack the fundamental qualities required for advanced membership. They are weak both individually and as a collective. Their military consists of primitive kinetic weapons and chemical propellants. Their ships are slow, their tactics predictable, and their warriors, he paused, his compound eyes settling on Sarah with undisguised contempt. Pathetic. A wave of agreement rippled through the chamber. The Zephyran war chief, Skilorth, stood next, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. In the past cycle alone, we have received 17 distress calls from human colonies. 17! They cannot defend themselves against even the most basic threats. Pirates, raiders, natural disasters. Everything sends them running to their betters for protection. Ambassador Harrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenched with barely contained frustration. These beings had no idea what humanity had faced, what they had survived. But the political realities of galactic diplomacy meant that showing anger would only prove their point about human emotional instability. General Morrison leaned forward slightly, his weathered face set in stone. He had fought in 3 major human conflicts and had earned every scar that marked his hands and face. But here, among these cosmic giants, his military achievements seemed laughably insignificant. The medal that hung from his chest, earned in the Battle of Arcturus Station where he had held a vital position for 18 hours against overwhelming odds, was dwarfed by the elaborate decorations that adorned the alien delegates. "Perhaps," spoke High Mediator Valnari of the Ethereal Collective, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, "we should examine the humans they have chosen as their representatives." This young female, the floating being, gestured towards Sarah with one of her translucent appendages. She carries herself with the bearing of one who has never faced true adversity. Look at her. She has not spoken a single word throughout these proceedings. Is this the best that humanity can offer? A silent child who appears ready to fade away at the first sign of conflict? The chamber erupted in what passed for laughter among the various species. The Krillians' chittering clacks echoed off the walls, while the Vorthax bubbles pulsed with bioluminescent patterns of amusement. Even the typically stoic Zephyrins allowed themselves hissing sounds that approximated mirth. Sarah's face remained calm throughout the mockery, though her colleagues noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. Her fingers moved almost imperceptibly to touch the small medal at her throat, a gesture so subtle that none of the alien observers caught it. The metal was warm against her fingers, worn smooth by years of handling, and for just a moment her mind drifted to a different time and place. The memory came unbidden, the screaming of alarms, the taste of smoke and blood in the air, the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on shoulders that everyone said were too small to bear such burdens. She remembered the faces of those she could not save. The medal around her neck had been earned in fire and darkness, paid for with costs that these beings could not even imagine. The human delegation has failed to provide adequate justification for their advancement. Their military record is one of consistent failure. Their technology is centuries behind the current galactic standard. Their representatives, his eyes swept dismissively over the three humans, demonstrate the very weakness that disqualifies their species from advanced membership. War Chief Sklorth stood again, his massive form casting a shadow over the human section. "I have reviewed their military files. Even their most decorated soldiers have achieved nothing that would impress a Zephyran hatchling. Take their General Morrison. His greatest victory was holding a single space station against a force of raiders. Raiders! Not even a proper military force. And this was considered such an achievement that they gave him a medal. The reptilian's laugh was like grinding scales. Among my people, such an action would be considered the minimum expectation of any warrior worth the name." Several other delegates voiced their agreement. A Vorthak representative pulsed with patterns that the translator rendered as, "Human conflicts are small, localized affairs between their own kind. They have never faced true galactic-level threats. They fight each other with primitive weapons over insignificant resources. How can such a species be trusted with the responsibilities of advanced membership?" Ambassador Harrison finally spoke, his voice steady despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "Honored delegates, while humanity may appear weak by some standards, we have qualities that should not be dismissed. Our adaptability, our resilience, our willingness to sacrifice for others." "Sacrifice?" Chancellor Vexthar's interruption was sharp with derision. "You speak of sacrifice as though it were some great virtue. Every species makes sacrifices. The difference is that when we sacrifice, it is from a position of strength, choosing to give up something valuable for strategic advantage. When humans sacrifice, it is usually because they are too weak to defend what they possess in the first place." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. General Morrison's hands clenched into fists, and Ambassador Harrison's face flushed with anger. But it was Sarah who finally spoke, her voice so quiet that the chamber's acoustics had to amplify it for everyone to hear. "May I ask a question, honored delegates?" The sudden sound of her voice caused a brief pause in the chamber. Many of the alien representatives seemed surprised that the small human could speak at all. Chancellor Vexthar gestured dismissively with one massive claw. "You may ask, though I fail to see how anything you might say could possibly change the obvious conclusions we have reached." Sarah stood slowly, her movement graceful despite the way the massive chamber seemed to dwarf her even further. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the translation systems, and there was something in her tone that made several of the more perceptive delegates lean forward slightly. "You have all spoken about military records and achievements. You have discussed strength and weakness, victories and defeats. But I am curious about something else. In all of your glorious histories of conquest and military might, how many of you have ever faced an enemy that you could not simply overpower through superior technology or numbers?" The question seemed oddly phrased, and several delegates exchanged confused glances. War Chief Sklorth hissed with what might have been impatience. "Warfare is about superior force, human child. That is the point. Only the weak seek to complicate what should be simple." "With trust, Teddy." "I see," Sarah replied, nodding thoughtfully. "And in your experience, what is the most dangerous opponent you have ever faced?" "The most dangerous opponents," Chancellor Vexthar answered with barely concealed irritation, "are those with the largest fleets, the most advanced weapons. This is elementary military science that even your species should understand." Sarah's fingers again found the metal at her throat, and for just a moment, those closest to her might have noticed that her eyes seemed to focus on something very far away. When she spoke again, her voice was still quiet, but there was something different about it now. Something that made the vast chamber seem somehow smaller. "That is interesting. Because in my experience, the most dangerous opponents are often the ones that everyone underestimates. The ones that appear weak and harmless until the moment they are not. The ones that others dismiss as insignificant right up until those others realize they have made a terrible mistake." A strange quiet had fallen over part of the chamber. Some of the alien delegates were beginning to look at the small human woman with more attention, sensing that there was something beneath her mild words that they were not quite grasping. "But perhaps," Sarah continued, her hand still resting on her medal, "the honored delegates are right. Perhaps humanity is simply too weak and insignificant to merit advanced membership. Perhaps our military record truly is as unimpressive as it appears to those who measure everything in terms of fleet sizes and technological superiority." She paused, and in that pause, something shifted in the atmosphere of the great chamber. Several of the more experienced military delegates were beginning to feel the first stirrings of unease, though they could not have said exactly why. "However," Sarah said, her voice still carrying that same quiet tone, "before we accept this judgment, I wonder if the Council would be interested in hearing about a particular military engagement that took place recently in human space. Not a grand battle between fleets, nothing that would impress those accustomed to massive displays of firepower, but perhaps educational nonetheless." The chamber had grown surprisingly quiet. Even the constant background hum of translation systems seemed muted. Sarah stood there, small and seemingly insignificant among the towering aliens, but something had changed. The metal around her neck caught a stray beam of light and glinted once, briefly, like a distant star suddenly flaring to life. Chancellor Vexthar shifted impatiently in his massive seat. "If you believe some minor human skirmish could possibly alter our assessment, you are welcome to waste our time with the tale, though I suspect it will only further demonstrate the very weaknesses we have been discussing." Sarah smiled then, and it was a gentle expression that somehow made several of the more observant delegates feel inexplicably uncomfortable. "Thank you, Honored Chancellor. I believe you may find this particular story illuminating." As she prepared to speak, the afternoon light streaming through the chamber's crystal walls seemed to shift, casting new shadows across the assembly. The great hall, filled with the galaxy's most powerful beings, waited to hear the words of a young human woman whom they had already dismissed as irrelevant. They had no idea that they were about to learn why humanity had survived long enough to reach the stars, or why those who appeared weakest sometimes proved to be the most dangerous of all. The story Sarah was about to tell would not just challenge their assumptions about human military capability, it would shatter their understanding of what courage truly meant. and reveal the terrible cost hidden behind that simple medal she wore around her neck. Era's voice carried clearly through the vast chamber as she began her tale, her words measured and precise despite the dismissive attention of most delegates. 3 years ago, there was a colony called Haven's Rest on the outer rim of human space. It was not a particularly important world by galactic standards. No rare minerals, no strategic military value, no advanced technology, just 43,000 people trying to build lives on a planet that most cosmic cartographers would not even bother to mark on their maps. War Chief Esglorth made a sound that might have been a snort. 43,000? A small settlement by any reasonable measure. Among my people, we would not even classify such a gathering as worthy of the name colony. Please continue with this tale of insignificance. Sarah nodded acknowledgingly but continued without apparent offense. You are correct that it was small. The colonists were mostly farmers, teachers, engineers, medical personnel, the kind of people who build communities rather than armies. They had chosen Haven's Rest specifically because it was remote, peaceful, far from the usual shipping lanes and conflict zones. They wanted to raise their children somewhere safe. She paused, her fingers unconsciously moving to touch her medal again. The colony's total defensive capability consisted of 1 orbital station with basic shields, 12 patrol craft that were primarily used for rescue operations and asteroid clearing, and a planetary defense force of about 200 volunteers. Most of these volunteers were part-time, people who held regular jobs and trained on weekends. High Mediator Velnari's ethereal form pulsed with what the translator interpreted as mild curiosity. This does not sound like the beginning of a military engagement, young human. It sounds like the description of a target. That, Sarah said quietly, is exactly what someone else thought as well. The chamber remained largely indifferent, but a few of the more experienced military minds among the delegates were beginning to pay closer attention. There was something in the human woman's tone, something in the way she spoke about this insignificant colony, that suggested the story was heading somewhere unexpected. The Devourers found Haven's Rest on a Tuesday morning, Sarah continued, and at the mention of that name, every being in the chamber suddenly became very still. The Devourers were not unknown to the Galactic Council. They were one of the most feared forces in the outer galaxy, a nomadic species that traveled in massive hive ships, consuming everything in their path. They did not conquer worlds. They stripped them bare of all biological matter and moved on, leaving only empty rocks floating in space. Entire star systems had been reduced to sterile wasteland by devourer swarms. The last major devourer incursion had required the combined fleets of 6 galactic powers to repel, and even then at tremendous cost. Chancellor Vexthar leaned forward in his seat, his compound eyes focusing intently on Sarah for the first time. You claim that the Devourers attacked this human colony? That is, unlikely. The Devourers have not been active in any galactic region for over a decade. Our intelligence networks would have detected such a movement. Your intelligence networks, Sarah replied with that same gentle tone, were focused on the core worlds and major shipping lanes. Haven's Rest was so far out on the rim that it barely registered on any galactic monitoring systems. That isolation, which the colonists had chosen for safety, meant that when the Devourer scout ships began probing the system, no one else knew they were there. She took a breath, and when she continued, her voice carried the weight of remembered horror. The first sign of trouble came when the colony's long-range sensors detected massive gravitational anomalies at the edge of the system. The colonists had never seen readings like these. Space itself seemed to be warping and twisting as something enormous moved through it. By the time they realized what they were looking at, the Devourer Advance Fleet was already past the outer planets. War Chief Sklorth's scales had begun to shift color slightly, a sign of agitation among his species. How many ships in this advance fleet? 17 hive ships, Sarah answered matter-of-factly, each one approximately 12 kilometers in length. The smallest carried a complement of roughly 200,000 biomechanical warriors. The largest, she paused as if the memory was difficult to process even now. The largest was something our sensors could barely comprehend. 28 kilometers long, mass readings that suggested it was more biological than mechanical, and energy signatures that indicated it was actively growing as it moved. A collective shudder ran through the assembled delegates. 17 Devourer hive ships represented a force that could sterilize entire sectors. The fact that such a fleet had moved undetected spoke to intelligence failures that had left a significant portion of the galaxy vulnerable. The colony's defense coordinator sent out distress calls immediately, Sarah continued. The nearest human naval base was 6 days away at maximum burn. The closest alien outpost belonged to the Vorthak Collective and was 4 days distant. Even if help had been dispatched immediately, it would never have arrived in time. High Mediator Valnari's form pulsed with concern. Our outpost in that sector was indeed contacted, but by the time the message reached us, it was too late to organize any meaningful response. We assumed that by the time we could arrive, there would be nothing left to save. This has always been the tragedy of Devourer attacks. They move too quickly for galactic response times. Yes, Sarah agreed. The colonists understood this as well. They knew that no help was coming. They knew that their 12 patrol craft and 200 part-time defenders stood no chance against 17 hive ships. By every rational calculation, Haven's Rest was already dead. She fell silent for a moment, and in that silence, the true weight of what she was describing began to settle on the Council. 43,000 civilians, including families and children, facing certain death from one of the galaxy's most terrifying threats, with no hope of rescue or escape. The colony administrator was a woman named Director Walsh, Sarah continued. She had been a logistics coordinator for the Human Merchant Marine before retiring to Haven's Rest. Not a military leader, not a strategic genius, just someone who had spent her career making sure supply ships arrived on schedule. When faced with the approaching Devourer fleet, she called a colony-wide meeting. Sarah's voice took on a different quality now, as if she were seeing the events unfold before her eyes. Director Walsh stood up in front of those 43,000 people and told them exactly what they were facing. She did not sugarcoat it, did not offer false hope. She explained that the Devourers would consume every living thing on the planet, that no rescue was possible, and that their orbital defenses would last perhaps 20 minutes against the approaching fleet. War Chief Sklorth made a sound of approval. At least this Walsh showed proper honesty in the face of certain death. Many species prefer comfortable lies when facing the inevitable. What did the humans do? Surrender? Flee in whatever ships they could find. Sarah shook her head slowly. Director Walsh then asked for volunteers. Not for a defense force. Everyone understood that was hopeless. She asked for volunteers to help implement something she called the Haven Protocol. Several delegates leaned forward. The term was unfamiliar, but something in Sarah's tone suggested it was significant. The Haven Protocol, Sarah explained, was Director Walsh's plan to ensure that the Devourers would find Haven's Rest to be the most expensive meal they had ever consumed. The idea was simple. If they were going to die anyway, they would make certain that their deaths cost the Devourers as much as possible. Chancellor Vexthar's voice carried a note of grudging interest, a spite strategy. Not uncommon among doomed populations, destroy infrastructure, poison resources, eliminate anything that might be useful to the conquering force. Crude but understandable. It was much more than that, Sarah said quietly. Director Walsh had spent months studying every available piece of intelligence about Devourer biology and behavior. She had identified 17 specific weaknesses in their feeding processes, 12 vulnerabilities in their biomechanical systems, and one critical flaw that no one else had ever thought to exploit. The chamber had grown very quiet now. Several of the military delegates were beginning to realize that this was not going to be a simple story of heroic sacrifice in the face of overwhelming odds. The first phase of the Haven Protocol required volunteers to modify the colony's entire food production system, Sarah continued. They introduced specific biological agents into every crop, every food processing facility, every water source on the planet. Not poison. The devourers were immune to most toxins. Instead, they introduced organisms that would remain completely harmless to human physiology, but would prove problematic for devourer digestion. High Mediator Velnari's translucent form rippled with what might have been surprise. They attempted to poison an entire world's biosphere? Such an undertaking would require enormous expertise and coordination. You said these were farmers and teachers. They were, Sarah agreed. But one of those teachers was Dr. Elizabeth Santos, who had a doctorate in xenobiology and had spent 15 years studying non-carbon-based life forms before retiring to Haven's Rest to teach elementary school. One of the farmers was Thomas Chen, who had been a biochemical engineer before deciding he preferred growing food to designing industrial processes. The colony administrator's assistant was former Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, who had served in human naval intelligence before accepting a position helping manage colony supply logistics. She paused, letting this information sink in. One of the things that larger galactic powers often fail to understand about human colonies is that they are not established by random groups of refugees or pioneers. They are carefully planned communities where people with diverse skills choose to build something together. Haven's Rest may have looked like a simple farming community, but it contained decades of accumulated knowledge and experience. War Chief Sklorth's scales had shifted to deeper shades of orange, indicating growing respect. These humans turned their entire world into a weapon. Clever. But the devourers are not so easily discouraged. 17 hive ships would not be stopped by biological contamination alone. You are absolutely correct, Sarah acknowledged, which is why the Haven Protocol had 17 distinct phases, each designed to exploit a different devourer vulnerability. Phase 2 involved modifying every piece of technology on the planet to emit specific electromagnetic frequencies that would interfere with devourer neural implants. Phase 3 required the colonists to deliberately alter the planet's atmospheric composition in ways that would cause cascading failures in devourer biomechanical systems. She continued methodically through each phase, describing how 43,000 civilians had worked with desperate efficiency to transform their peaceful world into an elaborate trap. They had poisoned their air, corrupted their soil, weaponized their infrastructure, and turned every aspect of their civilization into a carefully designed threat to the approaching hive ships. But the most important phase, Sarah said, her voice growing even quieter, was Phase 17. The final phase, the one that required the greatest sacrifice. The chamber waited in tense silence. Even the most dismissive delegates were now hanging on her words, beginning to understand that this story was unlike anything they had expected to hear from the apparently insignificant human delegation. Phase 17, Sarah continued, required volunteers to ensure that when the devourers arrived and began their feeding process, the trap would be triggered at exactly the right moment. It required people who were willing to stay behind and activate the final protocols manually, knowing that they would not survive the process. She touched her medal again, and this time several delegates noticed the gesture and began to understand its significance. 43,000 people lived on Haven's Rest, Sarah said softly. When Director Walsh asked for volunteers for Phase 17, 43,000 people stepped forward. Every single colonist, from the youngest adult to the eldest grandparent, volunteered to stay behind and ensure the Haven Protocol would succeed. The silence in the chamber was now complete. Even the background hum of life support systems seemed muted as the assembled delegates tried to process what they were hearing. In the end, Sarah continued, they selected 18 volunteers for Phase 17, just enough to trigger all the necessary systems when the time came. The rest of the colonists used every available transport to evacuate as many people as possible to a hidden facility in the outer system, where they could monitor what happened and, if the protocol succeeded, eventually return to rebuild. Chancellor Vexthar's voice was uncharacteristically subdued when he spoke. And you were there. You were one of the 18 volunteers. Sarah looked up at him, and for the first time since the session began, there was something in her eyes that made the massive Krillian warrior instinctively straighten in his seat. "No, honored Chancellor," she said quietly. "I was not one of the 18 volunteers." The confusion in the chamber was palpable. If she had not been one of the volunteers, how did she know these details? How could she speak with such certainty about events that had supposedly taken place on a doomed world? Sarah's hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her medal, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. "I was the person chosen to coordinate the Haven Protocol. I was the one who had to decide which volunteers would stay for each phase, who would live and who would die, and when exactly to trigger the final sequence. I was the person who had to activate Phase 17 manually while standing on a world that was being consumed by the most terrifying force in the galaxy. The silence that followed was absolute. Every being in the chamber stared at the small, quiet human woman who had just revealed that she had somehow survived an encounter that should have been impossible to survive. The metal around her neck no longer seemed insignificant. It seemed to pulse with the weight of events that defied comprehension. War Chief Cass Glorth was the first to find his voice, and when he spoke, there was none of his earlier contempt. That is not possible. No one survives direct contact with devourer-feeding fleets. The biomechanical conversion process leaves nothing behind. Sarah smiled then, that same gentle expression that had made several delegates uncomfortable earlier. But now it carried implications that sent shivers through beings who had thought themselves beyond such primitive reactions. "You are correct, honored War Chief. Under normal circumstances, no one survives direct contact with devourer-feeding fleets. But then, the circumstances at Haven's Rest were not normal at all. The great chamber of the Galactic Council had become a place of held breath and racing thoughts. Delegates who had spent the morning dismissing humanity as irrelevant now found themselves staring at Sarah Chen with expressions ranging from disbelief to dawning horror. The small metal around her neck seemed to have grown heavier, more significant, as if it were a talisman representing forces beyond their understanding. Sarah continued her narrative, her voice maintaining that same eerily calm tone that was beginning to unnerve even the most battle-hardened warriors present. The Devourer Advance Fleet arrived at Haven's Rest 72 hours after the first gravitational anomalies were detected. By that time, the evacuation was complete, the Haven Protocol was fully implemented, and I was alone on the surface with the monitoring equipment necessary to coordinate the final sequence. High Mediator Valnari's ethereal form pulsed with urgent patterns. "Alone? You said there were 18 volunteers selected for the final phase. What happened to the others?" For the first time since beginning her story, Sarah's composure showed the slightest crack. A shadow passed across her features, so brief that only the most observant delegates caught it. The final calculations showed that 18 operators would actually interfere with each other's effectiveness. The protocol worked best with a single coordinator who could monitor all systems simultaneously and make real-time adjustments based on devourer behavior patterns. War Chief Sklorth's scales had shifted to deep crimson, a color that among his species indicated profound respect for a worthy opponent. "You volunteered to face 17 hive ships alone so that others might live. This is beyond the courage expected even of our greatest warriors." Sarah shook her head slightly. "It was not courage, honored War Chief. It was mathematics. The protocol required someone with specific knowledge of xenobiology, quantum engineering, and devourer behavioral patterns. I was the only colonist with all three qualifications. There was no choice involved." Chancellor Vexstar leaned forward, his massive form creating new shadows across the chamber. "Continue your account. How did the Devourers respond to your world trap?" "Initially, exactly as predicted," Sarah replied. The advance fleet took up orbital positions around Haven's Rest and began standard feeding preparation procedures. They deployed sensory drones to analyze the planet's biosphere, established conversion stations to begin processing biological matter, and started constructing the massive feeding tubes that would drain the world of everything living. She paused, and for a moment her eyes seemed to focus on something very far away. From my position in the underground monitoring station, I could watch everything through the sensor network we had established. The Devourer ships were magnificent, in a terrible way. Organic architecture that seemed to grow and shift even as I observed it. Biomechanical systems that operated on principles our science barely understood. And the sheer scale, each hive ship was large enough to house millions of creatures. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Even in describing her enemies, the human woman's tone carried a note of what might have been admiration for their capabilities. The first indication that something was wrong came 6 hours into the feeding process, Sarah continued. The Devourers had begun extracting biological samples from the planetary surface, running them through their standard analysis procedures. Before beginning full consumption, their biomechanical systems started showing anomalous readings almost immediately. High Mediator Velnari pulsed with curiosity. The biological agents you had introduced into the ecosystem? Among other things, Sarah confirmed. Dr. Santos had identified 17 different compounds that would prove toxic to devourer physiology, but only when combined in specific ratios and only when processed through their particular digestive mechanisms. Individually, each substance was harmless. Together, and only when processed by devourer biomechanical systems, they created a cascading cellular breakdown that their immune systems could not compensate for. War Chief Sklorth made a sound that might have been approval, a delayed-action poison that specifically targets their unique biology. Elegant. But surely the Devourers would have detected such contamination before beginning full feeding operations. Under normal circumstances, yes, Sarah agreed. But the biological agents were only one component of a much larger system. While their analysis drones were trying to understand why their test samples were proving problematic, the electromagnetic interference we had embedded in every piece of technology on the planet was beginning to affect their neural coordination networks. She spoke with the precision of someone recounting a complex engineering process rather than a desperate battle for survival. Devourer hive ships operate through a form of collective consciousness that relies on quantum-level neural synchronization. Even minor disruptions to this synchronization can cause significant operational difficulties. The frequency patterns we had chosen were specifically calibrated to create interference that would gradually intensify as more of their systems came online. Chancellor Vexthar's compound eyes focused intently on Sarah. You are describing a level of understanding of devourer physiology that exceeds what most galactic intelligence services possess. How did a human colony acquire such detailed knowledge? Dr. Blackdick Santos had been studying non-carbon-based lifeforms for 15 years, Sarah replied. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez had spent 8 years in intelligence work that specifically focused on analyzing alien threat capabilities. Thomas Chen had helped design biochemical weapon systems before becoming a farmer. When people retire to frontier colonies, they do not stop being who they were. They simply choose to use their skills for different purposes. The implications of this statement rippled through the chamber. The galaxy's major powers had always assumed that frontier colonies were populated by refugees, dropouts, and those who lacked the skills to succeed in more developed regions. The idea that such colonies might actually represent concentrations of expertise and experience was a paradigm shift that several delegates were struggling to process. But even with biological contamination and neural interference, pressed War Chief Sklorth, 17 hive ships represent overwhelming force. These complications would have delayed them, perhaps caused casualties, but not stopped them entirely. You are absolutely correct, Sarah acknowledged. Which is why the Haven Protocol was designed in multiple phases that would cascade into a final decisive sequence. By the 12th hour of the feeding process, the Devourers had begun to understand that Haven's rest was not the simple target they had expected. They started implementing countermeasures, adapting their biomechanical systems to compensate for the interference and contamination. She paused, her hand unconsciously moving to touch her medal again. That was when I activated Phase 7 through Phase 16 simultaneously. The silence that followed this statement was profound. Several delegates were beginning to realize that Sarah's account was moving towards something far more catastrophic than a simple defensive success. Phases 7 through 16, Sarah continued, her voice remaining steady despite the magnitude of what she was describing, involved systematic overloads of the planet's power grid, deliberate destabilization of the atmospheric processing systems, and activation of a gravitational anomaly generator that had been hidden beneath the colony's primary settlement. High Mediator Velnari's form pulsed with alarm. A gravitational anomaly generator? Such devices are beyond current human technological capabilities. They are barely within the reach of the most advanced galactic civilizations. Thomas Chen had not simply been a biochemical engineer, Sarah explained. Before becoming a farmer, he had been part of a human research team studying captured alien technologies. The gravitational anomaly generator was a prototype device based on principles reverse-engineered from a derelict ship discovered in the Outer Rim 20 years earlier.
It had never been tested at full power. War Chief Sklorth's scales had shifted to colors that indicated profound unease.
You deliberately destabilized local space-time while 17 Devourer hive ships were in orbit around your world? The calculations suggested that the gravitational anomalies would be sufficient to disrupt Devourer formation flying and prevent them from implementing coordinated escape maneuvers. Replied. The atmospheric destabilization would create massive electromagnetic storms that would further interfere with their navigation systems. The fusion reactor overloads would generate enough radiation to overwhelm their biomechanical repair capabilities. And the power grid failures would create system-wide cascades that would affect every piece of technology on the planet simultaneously. She fell silent for a moment, and when she continued, there was something in her voice that made every being in the chamber lean forward despite themselves. What the calculations had not predicted was how the Devourers would respond to finding themselves trapped in an increasingly unstable system, with their primary food source actively fighting back in ways they had never encountered before. Chancellor Vexthar's voice carried a note of dread. What did they do? Sarah's eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the chamber walls, beyond the present moment, as if she were seeing events that still haunted her dreams. They did something that no Devourer fleet had ever done in recorded galactic history. They stopped trying to feed and started trying to fight. 17 hive ships, each carrying millions of biomechanical warriors, and began a coordinated assault on the planet's surface with the explicit goal of eliminating whatever was causing their problems. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. Devourers were feeding machines, not military forces. They consumed worlds through overwhelming technological superiority, and then moved on. The idea that they might actually engage in deliberate warfare against a planetary population was outside the experience of every major galactic power. I watched through the sensor network as they deployed ground forces for the first time in their known history, Sarah continued. Massive biomechanical constructs that could reshape themselves for different tactical purposes. Flying organisms that could operate both in space and atmosphere. Walking weapons platforms that were larger than our colony's buildings. And in the center of it all, something that emerged from the largest hive ship. A creature that was clearly the fleet's command consciousness made manifest. War Chief Sklorth was gripping the edges of his seat with claws that had unconsciously extended. You faced a Devourer warform. No one has ever seen such a thing, and survived to describe it. It was approximately 300 meters tall, Sarah said, her voice carrying the clinical precision of someone who had been forced to observe the unimaginable. Primarily organic, but with biomechanical augmentations that seemed to shift and reconfigure themselves as I watched. It moved across the landscape like a living storm, consuming everything in its path not for nourishment, but apparently for raw materials to create additional warrior forms. When it reached the location of our hidden monitoring station, it began systematically stripping away layers of rock and soil to find me. High Mediator Velnari's form had gone completely still, her usual gentle pulsing replaced by rigid attention. How did you survive such an encounter? Sarah smiled then, and it was an expression that contained depths of experience that made ancient beings feel suddenly young and naive.
I triggered Phase 17. The chamber waited in absolute silence.
Even the most powerful and experienced delegates were beginning to understand that they were about to hear something that would challenge their understanding of what was possible in a universe they thought they knew. Phase 17, Sarah said quietly, was designed around a single critical observation about devourer biology that no one else had ever thought to exploit. Dr. Santos had discovered that while devourers are immune to almost every known toxin and can adapt to virtually any hostile environment, they have one absolute vulnerability that their entire species shares. She paused, her hand tightening on her metal, and when she continued, her voice carried the weight of a revelation that had cost thousands of lives to achieve. Devourers cannot survive in the presence of a localized space-time collapse. Their biomechanical systems are too complex, too dependent on stable quantum relationships to function when the fundamental structure of reality becomes unstable. Phase 17 was designed to create exactly that kind of collapse. Chancellor Vexthar's voice was barely above a whisper. You collapsed space-time around an entire star system? Not the entire system, Sarah corrected. Just the local area around Haven's Rest. A localized implosion that would create a temporary singularity lasting approximately 47 seconds before stabilizing into a new gravitational configuration. Long enough to eliminate every devourer in the immediate area, brief enough to avoid permanent damage to the surrounding space-time structure. War Chief Asclorth's scales had gone completely white, a color that among his species indicated existential terror. Such a process would eliminate everything in the affected area. How did you survive the activation of your own ultimate weapon? Sarah's hand moved to her metal one final time, and now every delegate could see that the simple piece of metal was actually engraved with symbols that seemed to shift and move in the light, as if they were inscribed with forces that existed partially outside normal space-time. I did not survive the activation of Phase 17, she said quietly. I died with Haven's Rest when space-time collapsed around the planet. What stands before you now is something else entirely. The silence that followed Sarah's revelation was unlike anything the Galactic Council chamber had ever experienced. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something far more profound. The collective held breath of beings who had just been told that the fundamental rules of existence were not as absolute as they had believed. Chancellor Vexthar was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying a tremor that his species had not known they were capable of producing. That is impossible. Nothing survives localized space-time collapse. Nothing can exist outside the fundamental structure of reality itself. Sarah looked up at him with those same gentle eyes that had seemed so unremarkable when the session began. But now they held depths that made several delegates involuntarily look away. You are correct, honored Chancellor. Nothing should survive such an event. And yet, here we are, having this conversation. High Mediator Velnari's ethereal form was pulsing in rapid, agitated patterns that her species typically displayed only in the presence of phenomena that challenged their understanding of existence itself. Explain what you mean when you say you died with Haven's Rest. Explain what you are if not the human who activated this protocol. Sarah stood quietly for a moment, her small form seeming somehow more substantial than before, as if the very air around her had grown denser with implications that the assembled delegates were only beginning to comprehend. When Phase 17 activated, she began, her voice carrying a quality that seemed to resonate from somewhere beyond the normal boundaries of sound. The localized space-time collapse occurred exactly as calculated. The gravitational anomaly generator created a controlled implosion that affected approximately 4,000 cubic kilometers of space, including Haven's Rest, the 17 Devourer hive ships. She paused, and several delegates noticed that the light in the chamber seemed to bend differently around her, as if she existed partially outside the normal optical properties of their shared reality. The collapse lasted precisely 47 seconds, Sarah continued. During those 47 seconds, normal causality broke down within the affected area. Past, present, and future became meaningless concepts. Matter and energy existed in states that have no names in any known language. The Devour Fleet, their biomechanical warriors, their command consciousness, even the massive war form that had been pursuing me, all of it simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. War Chief Esclorth's voice was barely a whisper. And you ceased to exist as well. The human woman named Sarah Chen died in the first microsecond of the collapse, she confirmed. Her body, her memories, her individual consciousness, all of it was torn apart by forces that exist beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. But something else happened during those 47 seconds, something that the original calculations had not predicted. High Mediator Velnari leaned forward, her form now pulsing with patterns that indicated desperate curiosity mixed with existential dread. What happened? Sarah's expression became distant, as if she were remembering events that had occurred in a place where memory itself operated according to different rules. During the space-time collapse, the gravitational anomalies created a resonance effect with the quantum fields that maintain consciousness in carbon-based life forms. The dying thoughts, memories, and experiences of every being within the affected area became entangled at the subatomic level. She paused, and when she continued, several delegates realized they were hearing a description of something that challenged every known principle of physics and biology. And in the center of what had once been the colony's primary settlement, there was something new. War Chief Esclorth's scales had gone beyond white into colors that his species had no names for, hues that indicated psychological states beyond normal comprehension. What was there? A monument, Sarah replied, made from materials that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially somewhere else, covered with inscriptions and languages that had never existed before the collapse, but that somehow carried meaning that could be understood by any conscious being. And at its base, 43,000 small objects that had not existed before the space-time collapse, but that clearly belonged to individuals who had once lived on Haven's Rest. She touched her metal again, and now every delegate could see that it was not made of any metal that occurred naturally in normal space-time. It seemed to shift between states of matter, solid one moment and something else entirely the next. The rescue ships from the Vorthak Collective arrived 6 days later, Sarah continued. They found a world that should not have existed, covered with life forms that had somehow survived an impossible event, surrounding a monument to sacrifice that defied every known principle of physics. And they found me standing beside that monument, wearing this medal, with complete memories of events that had occurred during 47 seconds when time itself had no meaning. High Mediator Velnari's voice carried a note of desperate hope. Perhaps you are simply a survivor who was somehow shielded from the worst effects of the collapse. Perhaps the space-time distortion created protective fields that— No, Sarah interrupted gently. The rescue teams conducted extensive medical and psychological examinations. The being they found had Sarah Chen's memories, her appearance, her personality patterns, but cellular analysis showed that this body had never existed before the collapse. DNA patterns that included quantum markers from the subatomic entanglement process, neural pathways that incorporated information from multiple individual consciousness patterns. I am not Sarah Chen who survived an impossible event. I am what became possible when Sarah Chen and thousands of others proved that some things are more powerful than the fundamental forces of the universe. The silence that followed this explanation stretched on for what felt like hours. Several delegates had begun to back away from the human section, not in contempt or dismissal, but in recognition that they were in the presence of something that challenged their understanding of what life, consciousness, and existence itself could mean. Chancellor Vexstar was the first to speak, and his voice carried a note of awe that his species reserved for encountering forces beyond their comprehension. The metal you wear, it is made from materials that were created during the space-time collapse. Every human who participated in the Haven Protocol received one, Sarah confirmed. 43,000 medals, each one incorporating quantum patterns from the consciousness entanglement process. Each one a reminder of what happened when ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things in defense of what they loved. She looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of beings who had spent the morning dismissing her as insignificant. You asked about humanity's military record. You questioned our strength, our capabilities, our worthiness for advanced membership in this council. I have told you about one engagement on one small world where 43,000 humans faced impossible odds and chose to sacrifice everything rather than surrender to a force that would have consumed their families. War Chief Sklorth's voice was filled with something that might have been religious awe. You defeated 17 Devourer hive ships. You eliminated an entire fleet that could have threatened core worlds throughout the galaxy. You accomplished something that the combined forces of 6 galactic powers barely managed to achieve, and you did it with farmers and teachers and engineers who had never been trained for warfare. We did not defeat them, Sarah corrected quietly. We proved that there are some things more powerful than superior technology, larger fleets, or more advanced weapons. We proved that when beings are willing to sacrifice absolutely everything for those they love, they become capable of accomplishing the impossible. She stood there, small and seemingly fragile among the towering aliens. But now everyone in the chamber understood that her appearance was the most deceptive thing they had ever encountered. The metal around her neck caught the light and seemed to pulse with forces that existed outside normal space-time. A reminder that the universe contained possibilities that even the most advanced civilizations had never imagined. You asked me what the most dangerous opponent was, Sarah continued, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic forces. I told you that in my experience, the most dangerous opponents are the ones that everyone underestimates, the ones that appear weak and harmless until the moment they reveal what they are truly capable of. The ones that others dismiss as insignificant right up until those others realize they have made a terrible mistake. Chancellor Vexthar leaned back in his massive seat, and for the first time since the session began, there was something approaching respect in his voice. What are you asking of this council? Sarah smiled, and it was no longer the gentle expression of a shy young woman. It was something far more profound. The smile of someone who had looked into the heart of impossible forces and emerged changed by the experience. I am not asking for anything, honored Chancellor. I am simply explaining why humanity's application for advanced membership should be considered not on the basis of our fleet sizes or our technological capabilities, but on the basis of what we are willing to do when those we love are threatened. She paused, her hand resting on her medal. And when she continued, her words carried implications that would reshape the galaxy's understanding of what humanity represented. Because if there is one thing that the Haven's Rest incident should have taught the galaxy, it is that humans are capable of accomplishing absolutely anything when we are sufficiently motivated, and we are always sufficiently motivated when it comes to protecting our own. The aftermath of Sarah's revelations settled over the Galactic Council like the wake of a cosmic storm. Delegates who had entered the chamber that morning with absolute certainty about the natural order of the universe now found themselves grappling with concepts that challenged everything they thought they knew about consciousness, sacrifice, and what was possible when ordinary beings chose to do extraordinary things. Ambassador Harrison and General Morrison sat in stunned silence beside Sarah, realizing that they had spent years working alongside someone whose very existence represented forces beyond their comprehension. The woman they had known as a quiet, competent diplomat was something far more profound, a living reminder that humanity was capable of transcending the supposedly absolute limits of physical reality itself. Chancellor Vexthar was the first to break the profound silence that had settled over the assembly. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the arrogance and contempt that had characterized his earlier statements. Instead, there was something approaching reverence, mixed with the kind of caution that intelligent beings displayed when they recognized they were in the presence of forces that could reshape their understanding of existence.
"The implications of what you have described," he said carefully, "extend far beyond questions of galactic membership status.
If humanity is capable of surviving and transcending localized space-time collapse through sheer force of will and collective sacrifice, then every strategic calculation about human capabilities must be fundamentally reconsidered." Sarah nodded acknowledgingly, but her expression remained calm and somehow gentle despite the cosmic implications of what she represented. "That was not the intention of the Haven Protocol, Honored Chancellor. Director Walsh and the colonists of Haven's Rest were not trying to demonstrate humanity's strategic capabilities or to make any kind of political statement to the galaxy at large. They were simply trying to protect their families and ensure that the Devourers paid the highest possible price for threatening what they loved." War Chief Sklorth leaned forward in his massive seat, his scales showing colors that indicated profound psychological conflict. Among his people, strength and military prowess were the ultimate measures of worth. But Sarah's account had presented him with a form of power that existed entirely outside his species' understanding of what strength could mean. "The Devourers have been the galaxy's greatest fear for centuries," he said slowly. "Entire civilizations have fallen to their feeding fleets. Our most advanced military technologies have proven barely adequate to drive them back when they appear in force. And you eliminated 17 hive ships not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through something that our science says should be impossible." "The science is not wrong," Sarah replied. "Under normal circumstances, what happened at Haven's Rest could not occur. But the circumstances were not normal. When 43,000 people make a collective decision to sacrifice absolutely everything rather than allow evil to triumph, they create conditions that exist outside normal scientific parameters. High Mediator Velnari's ethereal form pulsed with patterns that indicated deep philosophical contemplation mixed with existential uncertainty. You are describing a form of power that is based not on technology or biological advantages, but on conscious choice and emotional commitment.
This challenges fundamental assumptions about how reality operates at the most basic level. Perhaps, Sarah suggested quietly, those assumptions needed to be challenged.
The galaxy has grown accustomed to measuring everything in terms of fleet sizes, energy outputs, and technological sophistication. But there are forces in the universe that operate according to different principles entirely. She stood and moved slightly away from her seat, and as she did so, several delegates noticed that the air around her seemed to shimmer with possibilities that existed just beyond the edge of normal perception. The metal at her throat caught the chamber's ambient light and seemed to reflect it in ways that defied optical physics, creating brief glimpses of colors that had no names in any known language. The Haven Protocol succeeded not because it was technologically superior to Devourer capabilities, Sarah continued, but because it was implemented by people who loved something more than they feared death. When beings are willing to sacrifice everything for others, they become capable of transcending the normal limitations that govern individual existence. A new voice spoke up from the section reserved for the ethereal collective, not High Mediator Velnari, but an ancient being whose translucent form pulsed with the slow, deep rhythms that indicated vast age and accumulated wisdom. "There are legends among our people," the ancient voice said, "of times when consciousness itself proved stronger than the physical forces that seemed to constrain it. We had dismissed these as metaphorical stories, philosophical allegories rather than accounts of actual events." Sarah turned toward the ethereal section, and her expression carried a note of recognition. "Perhaps your ancestors were more literally accurate than subsequent generations realized. The universe contains possibilities that most civilizations never explore because they never find themselves in situations desperate enough to require such exploration." Chancellor Vexthar's compound eyes focused intently on Sarah, the 43,000 medals that were created during the space-time collapse. "Are they all worn by beings like yourself? Reconstructed consciousness patterns that survived impossible events?" "No," Sarah replied. Most of the metals belonged to colonists who were safely evacuated to the outer system before the collapse occurred. For them, the metals serve as reminders of what their friends and families sacrificed to ensure their survival. But there are 18 metals, corresponding to the 18 volunteers who remained for the final phase, that are worn by beings who exist in a state similar to mine. The implications of this statement rippled through the chamber. 18 beings who had somehow survived the complete breakdown of space-time through collective will and shared sacrifice. 18 living reminders that humanity was capable of transcending physical death itself when sufficiently motivated. War Chief Esclorth's voice carried a note of awe mixed with what might have been fear. "Where are these 18 now?" "Scattered throughout human space," Sarah answered. "Some have returned to civilian life, using their unique perspectives to help solve problems that seem impossible to others. Some have chosen to serve in roles where their unusual capabilities can be used to protect human settlements from threats that conventional forces cannot handle. And some, like myself, have accepted positions where they can help represent humanity's true capabilities to those who might otherwise underestimate what humans are capable of achieving." High Mediator Valnari pulsed with a pattern that indicated sudden understanding mixed with concern. "You are saying that humanity now possesses 18 individuals who have transcended normal physical limitations through conscious sacrifice, 18 beings who exist partially outside the normal constraints of space-time itself. We prefer to think of ourselves as 18 people who learned that love and sacrifice are forces that operate according to principles that most civilizations have never had reason to discover," Sarah replied. "We are not weapons or strategic assets. We are simply humans who were changed by an experience that revealed possibilities most beings never encounter." She paused, looking around the chamber at delegates who were struggling to comprehend the implications of what they were learning. "But you are correct that our existence represents capabilities that extend far beyond what humanity's official military records might suggest. When a species is capable of transcending physical death through collective sacrifice, questions about fleet sizes and technological superiority become somewhat less relevant." A long silence followed this statement as the assembled delegates tried to process the complete restructuring of their understanding that Sarah's account represented. The morning had begun with discussions of humanity's military weaknesses and technological limitations. Now they were confronting the possibility that humans possessed capabilities that existed entirely outside the normal parameters of galactic power assessment. Chancellor Vexthar finally spoke, and his voice carried the weight of a decision that would reshape interstellar politics. "The Krillian Imperium withdraws its objection to humanity's application for advanced membership status. Any species capable of surviving and transcending localized space-time collapse clearly possesses capabilities that extend far beyond conventional military assessment parameters." War Chief Esclorth stood from his seat, his massive form creating new shadows across the chamber. "The Zephyran Confederation also withdraws its objections. We measure strength by the willingness to sacrifice for others, and what you have described represents sacrifice beyond anything in our cultural understanding. Humans have proven themselves worthy of respect." High Mediator Valnari's form pulsed with patterns of formal acknowledgement. The ethereal collective supports humanity's advancement to full council membership. Their demonstrated ability to transcend individual consciousness through collective will represents philosophical and practical capabilities that exceed those of many current advanced members. One by one, the various galactic powers that had spent the morning explaining why humanity was unsuited for advanced status formally reversed their positions. The small, seemingly insignificant species that had been dismissed as weak and technologically primitive was now being recognized as possessing capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about what was possible in a universe governed by supposedly absolute physical laws. Sarah stood quietly throughout the formal proceedings, her hand occasionally moving to touch the metal that had become the focus of so much attention. When the final vote was recorded, unanimous approval for humanity's advancement to full council membership, she spoke once more. I want to thank the assembled delegates for reconsidering their assessment of humanity's capabilities, she said, her voice carrying that same gentle tone that had seemed so unremarkable hours earlier. But I also want to remind everyone that the Haven Protocol and its consequences represent what humans are capable of when we are defending those we love. The 18 of us who survived the impossible did so not because we sought power or wanted to demonstrate superior capabilities, but because we were willing to sacrifice everything to protect our families and communities. She paused, and for a moment her eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the chamber walls. Beyond the present moment. The galaxy should understand that humans will always be capable of such sacrifice when those we care about are threatened. We hope that this knowledge will encourage peaceful coexistence and mutual respect, but it should also serve as a warning to any force that might consider humanity an easy target. Chancellor Vexthar leaned forward, and when he spoke, his voice carried genuine curiosity rather than the dismissive arrogance that had characterized his earlier statements. What message would you have us carry back to our respective civilizations about humanity's place in the galactic community? Sarah smiled, and it was the same gentle expression that had made delegates uncomfortable earlier. But now everyone understood the depths of experience and capability that lay behind that deceptively simple gesture. Tell them that humans are exactly what we appear to be, she said quietly. We are farmers and teachers and engineers who love our families and want to build peaceful communities where our children can grow up safely. We have no interest in conquest or domination or imposing our values on others. She paused, her hand resting one final time on the metal that represented forces beyond normal comprehension. But also tell them that when humans love something, we become capable of transcending every limitation that the universe attempts to place on us. Tell them that a species willing to sacrifice everything to protect what it loves should never ever be underestimated. And tell them that the 43,000 people of Haven's Rest proved that some things are more powerful than fleets, more durable than technology, and more dangerous than any force that operates purely through superior firepower. The session concluded with formal protocols and diplomatic procedures, but the real conclusion had occurred when a quiet young woman with gentle eyes had revealed that humanity's greatest strength lay not in weapons or technology, but in their willingness to sacrifice absolutely everything for those they loved. As the delegates filed out of the chamber, each carried with them a new understanding of what humanity represented in the galactic community. They had entered believing they were dealing with a weak species seeking protection and advantage. They left knowing they had encountered a civilization capable of transcending physical reality itself through the power of love and sacrifice. The medal around Sarah's neck caught the light one final time as she prepared to leave, and in that brief glint, observers might have glimpsed reflections of forces that existed beyond normal space and time, reminders that the universe contained possibilities that even the most advanced civilizations had never imagined, and that those possibilities became reality when ordinary beings chose to do extraordinary things in defense of what they held most dear. Humanity had gained advanced membership in the Galactic Council not through superior technology or military might, but by proving that some powers transcended every limitation the universe seemed to impose. And in proving that truth, they had forever changed how the galaxy understood the relationship between consciousness, sacrifice, and what was truly possible when love proved stronger than death itself.